My guest today is Dr. S.K. Baskerville, and we're going to be talking about what it means to be a gentleman, a topic that is sorely needed today. And my first question for you, Dr. Baskerville, is what is a certified gentleman? I saw in your book that it lists you as a certified gentleman.
Yeah, that was a little bit ironic because, of course, there's no such thing. The subject of a gentleman has been a subject of debate over centuries. The book, there's no place in the book where I give a 25 words or less definition. The book is an extended definition or a contribution to the definition that's evolved over the centuries.
Mm-hmm. And what's the difference between being a man and being a gentleman? I know this question you could probably leave a long answer for.
We could indeed, and the book deals with a little of both of those questions. And there have been a lot of manuals, books written recently on both those topics, and I tried to take them both into consideration because they're both part of today's crisis of manhood. Is the definition of a man and masculinity, and there is the additional question of the gentleman. My short answer I've been giving, I don't say this in the book, but I've been telling people that one of the prerequisites of a man has always been a demand to be courageous. Mm-hmm. And I argue that in some ways the problem today is not a lack of physical courage in men, it's often a lack of moral courage. So that might be a one definition, but there's more to it than that, of course. A gentleman is, in many ways, I suggest that it's something that's evolved specifically in the English-speaking world. I've never found any equivalent exactly in any other language that carries the same connotations. Even the French and other languages will use the English word gentleman when they're trying to discuss the subject, because it's really something that evolved in England specifically and was exported from there to the rest of the English-speaking world, especially to America, by way, I believe, of both the Puritans and the second sons of the English gentry who settled Virginia. So it's, and there's always been, in the idea of a gentleman, there's always been a tension between the status, the social status, the equation of the term with the gentry of England or the equivalent in America. And on the other hand, the idea of a moral or ethical element that constitutes a gentleman. So it's long been associated for centuries with a particular a class in England, a ruling class, the gentry, which was the ruling class. But also, all through the centuries, there have been people who've challenged that in the name of ethics, morality, and God, who have said that the ruling classes are not behaving the way they should be, and this is the way. There's ethical and moral considerations that you need to live up to. And that gradually has, I think, in the case of this country, especially the US, has kind of supplanted the older definition, and it's won the day, although not 100%.
Mm-hmm. What does moral courage look like?
Well, that's a good topic. It's standing up to, it's dealing with social situations, I think, especially in dealing with people in a place where you're not physically threatened, but you're threatened with not with physical danger, but with unpopularity for the most part, or other forms of social pressure. Mm-hmm. And a part of it is that ability to withstand social pressure and to uphold higher standards of what used to be called honor. And I think it's still a matter of honor in some ways, but it's a little different than how that was known in past centuries.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, excuse me, if I was going to just answer your question about what is moral courage. I argue that one of the themes of the book is that the crisis of men today and manhood and this ideal doesn't come primarily from other men. In past centuries, the challenge to one's masculinity tended to come from other men, the bully on the block or the rival in love. But today, the real challenge to men and to masculinity and to gentlemanliness doesn't come from other men. It comes from the culture, including the political culture. It comes from social pressure on not to be more manly, but in some ways to be less. Hostility to manhood, masculinity, the concept of terms like toxic masculinity, and attempts to so-called redefine masculinity, which means basically to water it down, to neuter it, to emasculate it, if you like, and even to eliminate it. So this is what I mean, is the willingness to stand up and defend not only yourself, and frankly, not only women as part of the old definition, but also your fellow man and larger principles like justice and truth.
On that topic of political correctness, how does a gentleman honor women without falling into political correctness?
Well, that's a big topic, and that's one I hope I dealt with adequately, because I talk about it a lot. Well, the traditional rules still apply. I haven't changed those at all. And by the way, I have consulted the books in the past, the classics from the Italian Renaissance and the English early modern period through the 19th century. And I've I find that the traditional rules are in many ways. I've also looked at my competitors today, the new versions today, and I think that in many ways the old versions are still valid. They sometimes need reformulating in today's world. I'm sorry, I've forgotten the question though.
Honoring women without.
Oh yes, honoring women.
Political
Well,
correctness.
again, the traditional rules I think still apply, and I don't have to outline what those are for most men. Women are to be honored, respected. They're to be protected. They're to be provided for in your family. And I talk about this, contrary to modern notions that they do not need to be protected and provided for. This generally is part of the mix. It does not follow that you necessarily need to accept every notion that pops into the head of every woman. Women have rules to obey also. I don't go into them, but I do acknowledge that they exist, and they need to be, they do not have, none of us have the right to just make up the rules that we want to obey and discard the others. So I argue that, a gentleman, the other feature of traditional chivalry and modern gentlemanly notions is that when you stand up for women and for the weak and for the underdog and for the oppressed, it doesn't mean that you necessarily join great political causes and do so, champion these things from the anonymity and the safety of a collective group. You oftentimes have to do it. You have to protect and defend and honor individuals, and you have to do it right now, often by yourself, without any. At the risk of danger and unpopularity. So we can't substitute political ideologies for masculinity or gentlemanliness. And I argue that in many ways, political ideologies are very hostile to men, more than anyone else.
You do a really good job of that in your new book. And the new book is titled A Gentleman's Guide to Manners, Sex, and Ruling the World. And it is available now. And to learn more about that topic that Dr. Baskerville just spoke about, he does an excellent job in the book of going very in depth on that topic. Should a gentleman be educated or self-educated, Dr. Baskerville?
Yeah, that turned out to be a more difficult topic than I realized, given the fact that I'm an educator. And I believe in the traditional education, the traditional liberal arts. And I outline that briefly, the kind of things that a man should do, a man should learn. What was a little tricky, though, was how do you fit that in? For whom are you addressing that? I mean, most people go to school, and many people in our country go to universities. But the schools are increasingly seem to be inadequate, and the universities are downright sometimes hostile to the traditional educational standards. And so I talk a little bit about how a man should negotiate these matters. In other words, you should see your education primarily as self-education, and it should continue your whole life. And if you missed it as a child because you weren't paying attention, or because you didn't have the opportunities to go to a good school, or because the school was corrupt, you're in good company. You're in the company of all of us, especially those of us who were raised in the 1960s and 70s. And you have to just make up for it, if not at one time in life, then in another, at an older age. And we all have to do that. Many of us have had to do that, and it's something you should continue. And if you do go to a university or a school or a snooty boarding school or something like that, don't rest on what they spoon feed you. Challenge it. Be skeptical. And make sure you're getting the right thing. And if you're not getting the right thing, get it yourself, and read the things that are no longer fashionable, or the things that they're not giving you in the school. So it requires a lot of initiative nowadays to be an educated man, to be a well-educated man. You need to be. I distinguish in the book. I don't know where I got this. I got it from someone. The difference between a critical mind and a critical spirit. I think you should have a critical mind is something where you question things, you're skeptical, you discern things, you analyze what you're being given. A critical spirit is just kind of a smarty pants, and is something we you should try and mitigate, because we all have that tendency, especially in adolescence. So I think not making that distinction is something that has caused the academic world to suffer these days. Having a critical mind doesn't mean just permanent rebellion against the world. Sometimes quite the opposite.
One of the challenges is to have a critical mind today. You can get canceled for just questioning.
Absolutely, yes. No, it's very dangerous, and that's another example of how even in your education, you need to exert a certain amount of courage. And having taught in the universities in several countries, and including Christian universities, I can attest that many people in the academic world, instructors, do not have a lot of courage today when it comes to. So it's difficult to expect students to do so, and even the best of them are walking a tightrope. They have to finesse if they want to impart any kind of valuable knowledge or learning to students. So it's very difficult, and it does require courage in the academic world to have integrity.
And you do have a really good reading list in your book that men can learn how to get self-educated as well. So
yeah, it's fairly standard. I did teach in a school of classical liberal arts, school dedicated to homeschooled students, and there's been more of that lately. I'm glad to see that there are many people in both secondary and university education who are pushing the classics, the liberal arts, and so forth, and it's certainly to be encouraged. But an education often has to be more than that. I also argue that it has to be, in some way, there has to be a practical element as well. It has to be applied sometimes, and that's sometimes a little more difficult.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I see today is you go to a wedding, you go to a funeral, high school, college graduation, and I'll see people in flip-flops, shorts, and t-shirt, even at church. Is this an acceptable way for a gentleman to dress?
Right. No. And sometimes you see, of course, dress that is, bordering on sexually provocative. No, of course it isn't. All of the traditional guidebooks throughout centuries, and even the modern ones, pay quite a bit of attention to men's attire. Sometimes it's even gone excessive. I mean, there are clubs of gentlemen who I think become what amounts to what's historically been known as a dandy. Of where you're obsessed with clothing, and that's obviously an extreme to avoid as well. But it is important. The cliche is that you're showing respect to other people. I prefer to say that you are you're projecting a default position toward the world that you want to please them. You want to please other people by the clothing you wear, and because presumably you like it and you want to share it with others. And even if you don't always have to want to please everyone forever, you might decide later that you don't want to please some people, but you at least that's the default position. That's where you start off in your relationships with other people. And the other thing that's important about it that I think men have not thought about is that the informal attire is not only childish and slovenly in many ways, it's also androgynous. It blurs the distinction between an adult and a child, because if informal dress is generally that of children. It also blurs the distinction between men and women. The more informal our dress becomes, the more we distinguish men from women. And that's in the interest, I think, of everybody, but I think especially men. Men have a distinctive status that they have to preserve. And when you dress in an informal way, overly informal way, you are basically you're not living up to that. A man's dress, not accidentally, a man's dress is always a kind of uniform, unlike a woman's in many ways. There's much less room for individuality in a man's formal dress and semi-formal dress, business attire. And the reason for that is because a uniform of any kind is an acceptance of duty. You're accepted certain responsibilities that go with it. In this case, a suit is a acceptance of the responsibilities that go with manhood, and that's what you're projecting. And when you blur those distinctions, this is certainly not in the interest of men today.
Mm-hmm. You know, you talk about that piece of blurring male female, but that's what society culture tends to want right now, is to have one sex, to have no distinction between male and female.
Well, some do, of course. Some
Right.
want that. Some
Not
want
you
that
and
quite
I.
explicitly. And but what's almost worse is that many people who don't want that go along with it without realizing it in many ways. And they're, in the way that they dress, the way that they talk, the pronouns they choose. I had to go through the book and remove at one point all of the gender neutral pronouns. I had to reminded myself, I'm writing a book for men. I can go ahead and say he and him. And yet I was not doing it. So we're all guilty of this, subconsciously or semi-consciously. We've been acculturated to this. We've been ashamed to be masculine, to be men, and speak about a man. We speak about guys and blokes and dudes and things like that, rather than men. And so we have to overcome this. I think it's being a man and is not something to be ashamed of.
That ties into that moral courage piece too, to point it out. And like you said, to not go along with it, there's he, him, she, her, mom, dad, father, mother. I mean, those are actual pronouns.
I would go even further. I don't talk about this in the book so much. Maybe the next book I will, but it's no accident that our language does make these distinctions. They're there for a reason. I haven't quite figured out what they are, but and English is not by any means the most the most rigid or aggressive about the use of gender. Of course, many other languages are much more so, and there's a reason our languages distinguish male and female. And when we overcome these, when we try to squash these and eliminate them, and I think we do so at there's unintended consequences to this.
I know feminism started before the 60s and 70s, but it really blossomed for like the second wave in the 60s and 70s. How has that impacted masculinity?
Oh, enormously. I mean, I think it is the biggest cause of it. There were other. I mean, the ideological element, I think, is the biggest. The aggressive feminism, which is hostile to masculinity, or even mild feminism, even so-called moderate feminism, is oftentimes hostile to the use of masculine specific, male specific words and characteristics and qualities and so forth. It's true. There have been other impersonal changes in our society that have brought this about, also that have complemented this. Many of us are not aware of it. I mean, the reduction of manual labor, the increase of the service economy, the increasing number of jobs that women can do just as well as men, have tempted all of us to go along with this and made this easier. And men played their role. Men played their role in the Playboy culture and the free sex and the hippie Woodstock movement and all this, and the free love. I mean, men were often willing accomplices in this in the sexual revolution generally. And so it's not entirely feminism, but that's what it led to. All the freedom. And I mean, this is what I think I've argued in my other books and elsewhere, is that in all revolutions and all radical changes like this, there's always a promise of freedom and release. And then it's followed by a day of reckoning. An authoritarian element comes down and crushes the whole thing. It's like, first come the rights of man, and then comes the reign of terror. It's kind of happened that way in the sexual revolution as well. The freedom, the ease. Men sometimes did. I don't like to say this too much, but men did sometimes found it easy to renounce some of their specifically male responsibilities, like military service, for example. And then they found that there are consequences to this.
Well, if you look at even here in the US, even the commercials, the recruiting commercials for military have totally changed. And most of the time they have females and not males in them.
Yeah. And this is very telling.
So
very irresponsible, in my view. No.
And it doesn't attract men.
No, it certainly does not. Yeah. No, it doesn't. Now, ironically, the military has become one of the most feminized institutions in our society. It's quite striking. And I mean, I hate to say I told you so, but I think we've seen, the last couple of weeks, we've seen the consequences of that. I'm not the first to point that out.
Unfortunately, we have. Has sex become a weapon since the 60s and 70s?
Yes, very much so. It has. And again, this is part of the problem. This is part of the dynamic of the sexual revolution that men really were trapped by, were foolishly trapped by. Again, they were promised freedom, the Playboy culture and so forth, sexual indulgence, and then then came the authoritarianism, the accusations of sexual abuse, sexual harassment, sexual misconduct, often very vague terms, sexual this and sexual that. And a good part of the book is about this, is about how men have allowed themselves to be, how the trap was sprung. We were lured into this, a kind of honey trap of, promises of sexual freedom all through the 60s and 70s. And then the feminists came down and started pointing the finger with accusations of not only civil accusations, sexual misconduct, sexual abuse, but criminal ones too, domestic violence, the rape or quasi-rape, sexual assault, and these movements like Me Too, of course, and these are not. The purpose of this is political power. The purpose of this is not to punish criminals. There's always been laws to punish criminals, including sexual criminals. But the purpose of this is to acquire political power. So men kind of did play into the hands of this. They allowed this to happen, and we have to realize that and get out of it now, because and I argue that I guess it'd be appropriate to say there's a kind of theological element to this as well, because on the one hand, men's groups complain, rightly, correctly, in my view, that they are the victims of injustice. And certainly there's nothing more horrible than a knowingly false, trumped up accusation of rape or child molestation or something like that. I mean, it's horrifying. And, men are right. They shouldn't do that. This is outrageous. This is non-negotiable. Our legal system should not be permitting this. But this book allowed me to say something, and I've said this in previous books, by the way, many times, but this book allowed me to say something a little larger from a theological point of view, and that is that, in some ways, it's an unjust accusation from man, but in some ways, it's a valid punishment from God. That we did indulge in many ways in over this decades in sexual freedom. And it doesn't make you a rapist. It doesn't mean you should be thrown out of the university. It doesn't mean you should spend 30 years in jail. But God is telling us that we were misbehaving, and this is the path. So if you look at things that way, it's a constructive way of looking at things as well. Even if you're not a Christian, just complaining and griping about the legal system or about feminists and so forth is only get you so far. At some point, you look at the sin within, and you say, what did I do to provoke this? And what can I do to get us out of it, to get us out of the situation? So I'm kind of urging men to do that, to put away even valid feelings of victimization and self-pity, and grasp the nettle. And that's why I call the book Ruling the World, because we don't want men who are the mirror image of feminists. We don't want men using language like sexism and gender equality and so forth. This doesn't get you anywhere. You become the mirror image of the people that are oppressing you, if you like, and they are oppressing you.
They are.
But if you grasp the nettle and you stand up and you say, I'm not going to be a victim. I'm going to be a ruler. I'm going to rule my domain that I have, whether it's myself, my family, my community, or whatever God gives me over the course of events. That putting away this kind of adolescent rebellion, putting away the childish rebellion that we all went through. But we had to, hopefully we learned from that to rebel constructively, and it's to urge men to see themselves as rulers, and because I argue that one of the most debilitating indulgences of a man is self-pity, and it's very tempting today when the courts have come and taken away your children, your home, everything you have. They've maybe thrown you in jail, and you may be living on the street, and it happens. But self-pity gets you nowhere.
one of the pieces you talk about in the book is marriage. And one of the things that you talked about in there that I really liked was you said one of the reasons for marriage is for kids to have fathers.
Absolutely. This is very important. And the groups today that advocate for marriage, there's two groups that have failed to grasp this. One is the groups that advocate for marriage, the Christian groups that advocate for marriage. They have not pointed this out, and they have not defended fatherhood well. They have often blamed fathers for things that are not their fault. But the men's groups have missed this also. Many of the men's groups have deserted marriage. They've said, they've kind of joined the feminists. They've joined their enemies. They've said, we don't want marriage. Marriage is a trap. Marriage is a ball and chain. Which, when really what the ball and chain is divorce, not marriage. But anyway, they've renounced the groups like MGTOW with very, very valid complaints. But they've renounced marriage. Sometimes they've renounced women and sex and any relations with the female sex. But I argue that this is a mistake. Marriage is the purpose of marriage. Is traditional marriage is to create fatherhood. The mother's relationship with the child is biological and undeniable. The father's relationship with the child is created by the society and its institutions, legally and culturally, and that is marriage. And therefore, men have a vested interest in defending marriage, standing up, making it again an enforceable contract. It has to be that, an enforceable contract in the law. And defending it, because that's where their paternal rights come from. That's where their paternal status. That's the difference between a man and a sperm donor is marriage, and they have to defend it. And they have to defend it, I think, more effectively than some of the Christians who pretend to be defending it but really aren't. Mm-hmm. Because I just add, the main threat to marriage today is not same-sex marriage or homosexuality. They're symptoms. They're symptoms of how extreme the problems become. But the problem was that willingness to break the marriage contract, to annul it, to make it, to wink at divorce, to make it, and thereby to destroy the status and the rights and the obligations of the father.
What else would you like to share with regular Catholic guys out there, Dr. Baskerville?
Oh, good question. The book was not really written. I was very pleased that my publisher allowed me to publish a book that was not really written for Christians or Catholics. I don't presuppose Christian belief, and I don't preach very much in the book about it. But I do try to show the ways in which Christian faith reinforces the status of a gentleman. Historically, that's undeniable. They grew up together in the course of from the Middle Ages onward, with codes of knighthood, and in the early modern period with the Renaissance and the Reformation and the 19th century novels in England. The concept of a gentleman and of a Christian gentleman were inseparable. And there's a reason for that. There's many reasons for that, which I couldn't go into in the book. I mean, I went a little bit into how Jesus exemplifies the ideal. I pointed out how the Puritans traditionally challenged the ethics of the gentry and mobilized them to take control of their society and see them and redefine their concept of honor away from wealth and status and houses and estates and lands, and see their status in terms of their fidelity to God and to other people. So, the Christian faith has traditionally always been part of a gentleman, and there's very important functional reasons for that. I think, again, it's something that couldn't have developed outside the Western world, and in some ways outside the English-speaking world. But so I urge people that to suspend disbelief, if you like. I point out that in societies where men are respected, where religion is respected, men are respected. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm advocating for the Taliban, but there are healthy and unhealthy concepts of religion and of manhood. But it is true that as religion declines, manhood declines with it, and men have an obligation. The churches have become increasingly feminized, and this is not healthy for the churches, and it's not healthy for the man or anyone else.
So Dr. Baskerville's book is entitled Gentleman's Guide to Manners, Sex, and Ruling the World. How do listeners get a copy of the book, Dr. Baskerville?
You can get it on my website, which is www.stephenbaskerville.com, Stephen with a PH. And you can also see my previous books, which cover some of the same themes, but they're a little heavier. They're a little bit more they're nonfiction writings, and they some people find them a little heavy, but they are they do cover some of the same topics. And also you can find it on the Sophia Institute Press website, which I believe is sophiainstitute.com/gentleman.
And I'll put that in the show notes.
Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Baskerville.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you. God bless.